101.3 Flirt FM.
You're listening to the Galway Gamer on Flood FM 101.3. My name is Owen Murphy and I am the Galway Gamer. And joining me on the line today from California in the US is the man behind Indiana Jones Raider of the Lost Ark, Yars Revenge and E.T. on Atari 2600. You may know him as the man who killed the video game industry. We are talking about none other than Howard Scott Warshaw. Howard, thank you very much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Owen, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. It's fantastic to have you on the mic. Now, let's start off, before we dig into your actual games, let's start off by talking about Atari as a whole. Now, many stories over the years claim that Atari was kind of a whirlwind of a company back in the 70s and early 80s. It was kind of the sex, drugs and rock and roll of the video game world. Was it really as wild on the inside as people claim?
It was absolutely as wild on the inside as people claim. It was the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the industry. At least the engineering department was. Because Atari, was segmented. There was other parts of the company that were not as wild, a little more staid, but engineering was sort of isolated off in another area because we needed to be, because things were pretty wild and woolly, particularly early on. It was an outrageous, creative orgy of fun and just creating a new medium. It was super exciting.
Every time I think of it, I just can't help but think of Wolf of Wall Street and how crazy things got in that movie. Was it similar to that?
I don't recall tossing any little people around, but the excesses that you see there were replicated to some degree. What you had was people who were essentially living at work because we wanted to be there all the time, which means all your recreation time as well as your work time has to be accommodated there. And when you're in an isolated building and you know that security has orders to keep the police and everyone else away from you just to insulate you so that we have the freedom we need, we take advantage of that freedom and we start doing some wacky stuff, and we did.
And did that help on the creative side of things, or did it act more as a distraction, if you will?
I think it helped. I think it helped a great deal. But the thing you have to remember about creativity is that creativity starts with creative people. And when people talk about, putting together creative environments, there are environments that are more conducive or less conducive for creative people to go ahead and create. And I think that's what we had at Atari, was we had an environment that was free enough to allow creative people to explore whatever they want and just remove boundaries and limits. Because the thing I like to say is that real innovators, real creative people, typically are people with boundary issues. Right? So if you don't put too many boundaries around them, they are free to expand and come up with anything in any direction. And that's healthy. But it still starts with having some creative people, because you can take some non-creative people, put them in a tremendously creative environment and get nothing out of them.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it does sound like a whirlwind of a time. And it seems to have, definitely for you, it seems to have worked out quite well because, well, straight out the gate, you were the man behind Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge was one of the biggest games on Atari 2600. And it's a fantastic game. It's a enthralling game, if you will, because it does have quite the story behind it. Now, that story is brought across then through like the little comic book that came with the video game. There's also kind of read-along records that bring the story across that way. Did you have any say in the way that story came across in other mediums outside of the game? And did it tamper with your view of Yars Revenge story at all?
That's an interesting question, because I actually was the one who wrote the story behind it. I've actually
Oh,
Yars
fantastic.
Revenge. Yeah, Yars Revenge was a big game for me, but it was a big game in a lot of ways. And one of the things I was trying to do with Yars Revenge was to establish myself as a video game creator.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to put everything into it on every level. But it also is a game that established a lot of firsts in the video game industry. And it was the first game with a backstory. No one had ever really done that before. And I wrote a backstory for it. I named the game. I did all of this stuff. It's funny when you say the story behind Yars Revenge, because there's the backstory of Yars Revenge, but the full story behind Yars Revenge about how the game evolved, created, went through various phases, and then was challenged and almost wasn't released because it became the most tested game in Atari history. If you want the full story of Yars Revenge and E.T. and all of that stuff, of course, I would refer you to my book, Once Upon Atari, How I Made History by Killing an Industry. That's available on Amazon now. But one of the things I detail in that book is the idea that creating that backstory was something that was important to me to lend more substance to the product, particularly as marketing was concerned. And it just seemed like a natural thing to me to do. And I didn't even think of it as doing something no one had ever done before. To me, it just seemed like a natural thing to do with the game. It turned out to be very innovative. But everything about Yars Revenge, I wanted to be just brilliant and a first. You know, it's the first full-screen explosion. It was the first backstory. It was the first time an Atari programmer was credited as programming a game. It was the first game that had a pause mode in it, which was very interesting.
Oh, wow.
So there were things I wanted to do in Yars Revenge. I just wanted to make something that just grabbed people's attention. And because I wanted to demonstrate that I could be a player in the video game making world, as opposed to just a player in the video game playing world. And that was what was important to me, was to try and establish myself. And I think I acquitted myself well with that game. And I've always been very proud of Yars Revenge. I just think I'm really happy to have done that game.
And the story itself then, as you made that, had you any idea just how far storytelling would go when it comes to the interactive medium of video games? Because we look now at the likes of these huge story-driven games, the likes of God of War Ragnarok, the likes of, say, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the likes of any of the Final Fantasies. These are huge narratives. Having kick-started that idea of these narratives, did you think it would expand that far?
To be perfectly honest, I did not. I did not. The thing about working at Atari and making games, for me at least, it was never about looking into the future to see where is this going to go. It was always about what am I going to do next tomorrow. That's where my head was at. So when I wrote the story for Yars, I realized that any other game I was going to do that didn't already have a narrative, like Saboteur, which was the fourth game I did at Atari, any other game that didn't already have a built-in narrative like the movie games do, I was going to make sure there was a complete backstory behind it. But I didn't think about, well, where does the idea of backstory go in video gaming? Because my whole attention was always focused on what am I going to do next in video gaming? You know, what can I break through? What can I do? So to me, it was rarely about elaborating existing concepts. It was always trying to think of something that didn't exist to bring that into focus and bring that along. But I'll tell you, one real exception to that is Easter eggs, the idea of Easter eggs. Because I did not invent the Easter egg for the video game. That was done by Warren Robinette in the adventure game. Mm-hmm. But what I did was really elaborate the Easter egg concept. I also, another first for Yars Revenge, it was the first game that had a marketing approved and endorsed Easter egg that was a part of the whole product concept and was even mentioned in the manual. Because I decided Easter eggs shouldn't just be this secret. I don't know if your listeners are aware of what the real genesis of Easter eggs is, but I can tell you what it's about. Is like nowadays Easter eggs or cheat codes and things like this are they're considered game enhancements, right? There's something else, something extra you can have to enjoy the game or find within the game for like a treasure hunt mode that's exciting, and it gives you a metagaming level that's kind of fun. But that's not why Easter eggs started. The reason Easter eggs started, as I mentioned before, Yars Revenge was extremely unusual in that it actually got the name of the programmer published with the product. And that's because of the comic book that went with it, right? My name was in the comic book as the programmer because they would never put the name of a programmer with the manual or on the box. Atari just would not do that. But we all knew that. So there was an interesting problem that presents for a programmer. Let's say you're someone who did a game for Atari and you leave Atari and you go to work somewhere else, and they say to you, well, what have you done? You say, well, I did this game for Atari. And they'll go, oh, yeah, sure. I'm sure you're the guy who did it. People might say, you're full of crap. People may not believe you. And so because Atari did not credit programmers, so the idea of the Easter egg was to put something in the game that only the programmer knew and only the programmer was really capable of bringing about. And that way you could prove authorship. And so that's why the first Easter egg has the name of the programmer, right? It says created by Warren Robinette. In Adventure, you can find a room that does that. In Missile Command, you can find an RF in some cases because that's for Rob Fulop, the guy who made that game. Easter eggs were about protecting your authorship and your identity. That's what they were for originally, because Atari was an exciting world and a fun world and a crazy world, but it was also a very paranoid and suspicious world. And so, it was always a question of who is zooming who. And that's one thing I go into quite a bit in the book, in my Once Upon Atari book, is about what it's like working in an intensely successful environment, the paranoia, the partying, the fun, the excitement, and the incredibly heroic efforts to try and deliver products, and the successes and the failures that go on, and the toll that takes on a personality.
And is that paranoia that you speak of, is that why programmers were not allowed to put their names within the game? Is that why that people would never know who programmed game X or game Y? Was it due to that paranoia you speak of?
Yeah, like I said, it was an effort to protect your identity, but the only reason you do something like that is because you feel the need to. So there is a paranoia element that came about because, and that wasn't really the case under Nolan Bushnell so much, but it was once Atari came out, once Atari got handed over to Warner, once Warner kind of really took the reins and started driving things at Atari, it was clear that it was no longer going to be an engineering focused or creatively focused entity. It was going to be a marketing and sales entity and a profit center. And the esteem for creativity dropped tremendously. So those of us who were all about being creative felt we have to fight the development system to get something out of it, and we have to fight some of the other elements of the company to try and protect the integrity of the work we're trying to do, because nobody really cared about quality. They just cared about getting something out the door, especially if it had a license attached to it. And many of us really took umbrage at that, because we were proud of our work and we wanted to defend the quality of our work. And we also believed that, not caring about the quality of your product is a very short-term strategy in a market. You want to have a longer-term strategy of earning customers with quality product. Of course, none of us really realized that we were looking at a very short-term market at the time, given the coming of the crash in the early 80s, which is another thing that I've detailed extensively in the book.
Well, let's talk about the licensed games that you mentioned there, because after Yar, you started working on Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. How do you go from creating your own game like that to working with something as huge as Spielberg?
Well, it was on the success of Yars Revenge that the prospect of working on Raiders of the Lost Ark came up, because Yars was viewed as a very good contribution. And now it was time, and Atari bought the rights to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that was going to be the first ever movie to game conversion.
Mm-hmm.
So Spielberg wanted to interview the programmers to decide who was going to do it. And so, but he doesn't come up to see us to interview people. You know, you go see Spielberg when Spielberg wants to interview you. So I flew down to LA for an interview with him, fought the morning traffic in LA, which is horrendous, and got up at like so early in the morning, like before the sun, you know, got on an early plane, all stuff I hate to do. But it's a little sweeter when you're doing it to go have an audience with Steven Spielberg, who was an idol of mine. And I got to the studio at 9:30, just in time for my meeting, only to be informed it was going to be, the meeting had been delayed 6 hours. And so but then I was treated to a full day, unescorted, free reign at Warner Brothers Studio, which I fully took advantage of. And then I did get to meet with Steven Spielberg, and we chatted, and I showed him Yars Revenge, and he seemed to enjoy that. I think the thing that really clinched it for me was when I explained to Steven Spielberg my theory about how he's actually an alien, which I go into that fully in the book, but I said to him, I have a theory about how you're actually an alien yourself. Would you like to hear it? He says, yeah. I laid the whole thing out for him. I think he really enjoyed that. And when I got back to Atari in Northern California, I was informed that Spielberg had called up and said, you know, Howard's the guy, let's go with it. And that's how I got to do Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I can't believe you told him a story about how he was an alien. That's phenomenal.
Well, it made sense to me, right? I mean, he was. I told him he was part of an alien advance team that was culturalizing our planet to prepare us to meet the aliens who were coming and wanted to make sure there was a warm reception as opposed to a hot one, as you know what I mean.
Oh, marvelous. Well, let's talk about the Spielberg titles then, because Raiders of the Lost Ark went across really well. However, E.T. not so much. It wasn't well received, and it was made on a very, very tight time frame in order to get it out for the holiday season. Considering Raiders of the Lost Ark is, well, it's kind of an action movie, there's a lot more there that can be translated to games due to the fact that, well, games is an action-orientated format.
Absolutely.
But E.T. is not so much action-based, like, at all. So where does one start on a tight time frame with Steven Spielberg over them? Where does one start to put a game like that together?
Well, Owen, I mean, it's a very insightful comment that you're making, and I think it's a very important point to note. And you're absolutely right. Something like Raiders of the Lost Ark has a through line of action and a real plot, you know, moving forward. It's a very easy thing to follow in an action adventure game, and it lends itself to that medium. Mm-hmm. E.T. is an emotional tone picture. Video games are not about emotional tone, and even the ones that might be, they were not on the 2600. You know, you need really good graphics to get emotion out of a video game in a lot of cases, and the 2600 was not there. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, you're right, it was a tight schedule, but I don't know if people really understand how tight that schedule was. Whereas I did Yars Revenge in 7 months. Mm-hmm. Raiders of the Lost Ark took 10 months to do, but I was only given 5 weeks to do E.T.
Oh my word.
So no one had done a game in less than, 6 months or so at that point. And I was given 5 weeks to do a game. And I was the one who was crazy enough to say, yes, I can do it. No one else would. In fact, multiple other people had already rejected the idea as impossible. So the president of the company, the CEO of the company, the CEO of Atari, called me directly in my office to ask me if I would do the game. And I told him, absolutely, as long as we reach the right agreement. And we did. Mm-hmm. So it was an amazing challenge, and that's what I was looking for. I was looking for a mountain to climb, and at the time where I really wanted a mountain to climb, they found a mountain to dump on me. that was the E.T. project, and that's how it started. It was like the fact that anybody would say they would. And And the truth is, I did deliver a game in 5 weeks. You know, people can say all kinds of things about it, and I don't dispute those or argue with them. There are some major problems with the game, but it is a playable, fully done, debugged game that passed quality assurance and went to market. And, you know, I don't believe, just like a lot of people don't believe, that E.T. is actually the worst game ever made. But interestingly, I do prefer when people identify E.T. as the absolute worst video game. You know why?
Go on.
I'll tell you, because Yars Revenge is frequently cited as one of the best video games ever made. So as long as E.T. is one of the worst, I have the greatest range of any game designer in history.
That's fair. That is more than fair. I have heard it being referred to as the worst game of all time quite a number of times throughout the years. And I've always thought to myself, whoever says that hasn't played enough video games, unfortunately, because there are some real dodgy ones out there. But let's continue on with E.T. at the moment, because that's the one that became legendary.
Right.
And one of the reasons it became legendary is because there was this urban legend, if you will, that there were 2,600 cartridges buried in a landfill in New Mexico. Now, in 2014, we discovered that that was actually true. Did you realize before the excavation began that these were indeed buried there, and it wasn't just urban legend?
I did not realize that. In point of fact, I always disputed it. I always believed it wasn't even remotely possible, because if you think about it, this is a company that is hemorrhaging money. Atari was the fastest growing company in American history. And then it turned around within a couple of years to become the fastest falling company in American history, which is quite an achievement if you think about it. But when it was losing, when it was falling and they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars, the idea of, it's to take a bunch of inventory, truck it out into the desert, run it over with tractors, then cement over it and bury it fully, that's a very expensive operation. And if you really have stuff that is so worthless you're willing to just bury it somewhere, why would you spend all that extra money when you're already losing money? You'd think you'd want to be trying to make money somehow. So it didn't make any sense to me that they would spend extra money trying to get rid of something that was worthless. Okay? So I never believed in it. But that's, as I say in the book, there's the things that when you're expecting things to make sense, you're losing touch with Atari. Right? Atari was never about making sense. It was just about making outrageous fun and doing it in outrageous ways. And that's what Atari was about. So when I did not anticipate it being there, there was a movie, Atari Game Over, that was made about it. And I was kind of hoping it would be there because I thought this movie is really going to suck if we go through all this stuff to go through this whole excavation and there's nothing there. I think that's going to be kind of a waste. But it was very interesting to see how this unfolded. And when the games came up out of the ground, you can see in the movie, I got very emotional. And what some people have said to me is, oh, well, you were sad because they buried your game. That's why you were emotional. These people were not paying attention to the movie, because I'll tell you, what made me emotional, and I think this is it, and I think, and you'll certainly understand this as a media producer yourself, right, is what do you want to achieve with a piece of media? Any piece of media that we produce, what you'd really like to do with it is you'd like to inform, you'd like to entertain, and I think generate social discourse. To me, that's like a great piece of media. It does all three of those things. And I always looked at video games as a broadcast medium. That's the way I look. I didn't look at it as a computer program. I looked at it kind of as entertainment, but specifically to me, it was a broadcast medium and a new medium. And that's the way I approached video games. So what happened was when these games showed up, the crowd, there was a swell of noise from the crowd. Now, first off, you've got to understand that what's the last time you saw hundreds of people lined up waiting to get into a garbage dump, right? That's what was happening that day.
Mm-hmm.
And all these people, hundreds of people, were all crowded around this area. And when the games came up out of the ground and they identified an ET, and here it was, people were so excited and so cheering. And there were representatives from news organizations all over the world. It was like a huge story because this urban legend really had a lot of traction. And so people were interested to know, is it true? Is it not true? So when it happened, there was this incredible swell of emotion and excitement. Mm-hmm. And here's what passed through my head, is that here's this thing. I spent 5 of the toughest weeks of my life producing a piece of media nobody believed could possibly be produced in that time. And I did that over 30 years before this moment. And here it is, 30 years later, this little, a few K of computer code that I wrote all those years ago is still generating all of this interest and all of this excitement and all this hoopla. And this whole thing is built around the fact that I had done this game all those years ago, and because I could have very easily have just failed at the game and then none of this ever would have happened. Mm-hmm. But it was there, and here it was, and I thought, here's my little piece of media is still alive 30 years later and generating excitement and enthusiasm, and I was overwhelmed in that moment. The joy that was going on in that moment, I really felt I could connect with, having been like on some levels the source of that originally. And it was emotionally overwhelming for me, and I literally just started crying. I was so happy to think that my work was generating this kind of fun and enthusiasm. That just meant an incredible amount to me. It was one of the great moments of my life.
That's fantastic. And it's one of the reasons that, that E.T. has the legacy that it has today, is A, because of the game and because of the hard work that went into the game, B, because of that crazy urban legend that went with it that by some bizarre chance wound up being true. It's absolutely phenomenal. I personally believe that it lifted the whole thing to new heights. But let's talk about Atari Game Over. The documentary is superb. It's a real tearjerker. It's an emotional roller coaster throughout. And I'd like to know if it has changed the perception in 2022 as we speak today. Has it changed the perception of how people, how people perceive E.T.? Because prior to that, E.T. was kind of the internet punching bag. And they would, it was easy to find videos knocking it left and right. But has it changed since that? Have people got more of a heartwarming feel for it since the documentary came out?
That's an interesting question, because I don't think that it has changed the public perception of the game of E.T. What I do think is it changed the classic game market perception of the game, in that signed copies became a little more valuable, and anything that was associated with the dig itself got a tremendous increase in value. Mm-hmm. So it did impact things on that level. The movie is a great movie, and it is a great telling, not just of what went on with E.T., but of, Atari on some levels is a microcosm of ancient Rome. And you could say that, Ray Kazar was fiddling while Atari burned, and everything just fell apart, because it really was about the kind of excess and how that overtook everything and it all fell to pieces. And it really does have that storyline to it. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's brilliant about the movie is I think the movie really shows the arc, the going up and the going down and people's differing perceptions. Because I don't know if you're familiar, but I'm no longer programming these days. I'm actually a psychotherapist these days. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoy that work. This is the most satisfying work I've had since I worked at Atari all those years ago. It was my life was a wasteland for many years before that, in search of some kind of meaning. And I've really found it here. But looking back on Atari as a therapist, as an economist, because I also have a degree in economics, as an engineer, and as just someone who was there enjoying the environment, it just gave me a unique combination of perspectives that I felt that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because I just had to use my accumulated knowledge and experience and analysis to really try and clarify for people. Like you say, this is a story that people speculate about. They have all kinds of ideas or fictions or stories about it. And I would see all these things going about, and I was there. I mean, I know what the story is and the story of Atari at large. Sometimes you just need to tell the truth. Sometimes it's just hard to watch a bunch of speculation and ridiculous stories floating around that people kind of buy into. And you think, that's just absurd. I needed to tell the truth, particularly since I think the truth was actually more compelling than it. So that's what I did with that book. And so Once Upon Atari really is the truth about what was going on inside Atari, the ramifications that had outside Atari in terms of the destruction of the industry, what life was like leading up to something like Atari, and the impact that something like Atari has had on my life and still continues to have to this day. And also, as well as all of the inside understanding and thinking behind what went on with something like E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, Yars Revenge, all of that stuff is there. But, the big story is just that an amazing cultural phenomenon took place at Atari, right? Atari made video games a worldwide phenomenon, and then they kind of disappeared. And that's an amazing flame out, right? On so many levels. It's just a phenomenal story. And, there's the light that burns brightest, burns shortest. And all the mistakes that Atari made, because they were the first ones. So they made all the original mistakes, but they didn't have the longevity to cash in on their mistakes and learn from them and do better. So the next round of video game producers in like Sega and Nintendo, the people who revived the world for video games after the crash, they benefited from Atari's experience. Atari never did. Atari just sort of went down in flames, and they did it as proud as they climbed the hilltop in the first place. And that is a very interesting thing to see from the outside, but it is a really interesting thing to be able to observe from the inside. And as a psychotherapist, it is a very interesting thing to be able to use as a teaching lesson for corporate politics and dynamics and the struggles between creative engineering groups and aggressive marketing groups, all of which have good motivations and solid people and smart, well-motivated individuals who are all trying to do the best for everybody. But it's just interesting to see how a group that should all be working together can end up into opposing factions and actually start to, reduce each other instead of support each other. Because that's a phenomenon that was very much on display at Atari. And a lot of the people who have read my book keep telling me they see all the nuances and the threads and the things that I describe in this book in companies today, in the same companies they're doing today. Because any company that is a creative, technically based company has the same kind of issues and the same kind of problems that we did at Atari, because no one's really solved them yet. And part of the reason they don't solve them is because people don't change. Times change, toys change, but people don't really change. That's one of the great things about becoming a therapist, right? As an engineer, I have to relearn my craft every few years because technology is constantly evolving. But individual people do change from time to time, but the human race, we're the same people we were several thousand years ago. We just have much better toys.
Where can people get Once Upon a Time at Atari? Once Upon Atari. Where can people get the book, and where can people dive into all this Atari history?
Well, I mean, you can get it at Amazon. It's available there. It's available at a lot of online. I have an ebook version that's available in a lot of outlets all over the world. Amazon has the paperback. I am currently doing the audio book. That should be out by Christmas, because anything about ET has got to be available by Christmas.
And are you voicing it yourself, like?
I am. I am reading it myself. I play a lot with language because I just think that's fun. And I wouldn't trust someone else to really carry the nuance of everything that I was doing. At the same time, I also believe that a memoir, which is essentially what this is, a memoir needs to be read by the person whose life it is. I think that brings a reality to it that I think just enhances the material. And I just want this to be the best book I can make it. So I'm working on that now, have it out. Anybody who wants to can go to onceuponatari.com. Onceuponatari.com, you can get autographed versions of the book from me. I will personally autograph it for you. Also, I have my Once Upon a Atari DVD, which is very different from the book. That's something I did several years ago. That's actually a collection of interviews with the actual game makers throughout the VCS department, and Nolan Bushnell and a lot of people like that who really made the games and created Atari. And it's all of their perspectives on what went on there and a lot of the shenanigans that went on, a lot of the things that went on, the infighting and the battles. It's some very interesting material. So I hope people will check it out.
And just to finish up then, Howard, when people claim that you were the man who killed the video game industry, this completely outrageous claim, this huge claim, what is your response to that?
Well, I tell them, I thank you very much for your confidence in my abilities, because that's awesome, but I can't really take full credit for it. In fact, I can hardly take any credit for it, because the thing that really, in the big picture, the thing that really killed the industry there was no one game that killed the industry. It was a cultural shift and a mindset. I'll tell you, there's an acronym in the book that's BMOBS. BMOBS is what I call it. And that stands for Believe My Own Bullcrap Syndrome. Right? And there is something that really was a big causative factor in the crash. But I mean, the title of the book is ironic in the idea that it is absurd that any one game or one person would really destroy the industry. The industry fed on itself, cut its own legs out from under it, and then crumpled under the weight. And if you really want to know how that happened, what all the contributing sources are, and the kinds of things that did that still exist in companies today, so you can play a little defense with your own company, pick up the book. I think you'll find it most enlightening. But, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
It has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for chatting with me. Tell me, do you have a social media account where anybody can keep up with you?
Absolutely. You can find me at Howard Scott Warshaw on Facebook. You can find me at HS Warshaw on Twitter, at HSWMFT on Instagram. And, you know, the social media platforms are shifting and changing so much, you never know where I'll pop up next. That's for sure.
Fantastic. This has been a thrilling conversation, Howard. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, and you're so welcome. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
101.3 Flirt FM.